Welcome to our discussion today. The topic is launch and iterate. We have a fabulous guest, Dr. Ron Goetzel. Ron, it is so great to have you. And Ron, where are you coming from?
Well, first, Laura, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always so much fun spending time with you virtually or live and in color. You're such a firecracker. You're so dynamic and interesting. And accomplished person. So I'm really honored to be on your show. I'm coming to you today from Bethesda, Maryland.
Well, welcome, and I'm so excited to have you. So for our listeners, I know we've got a lot of people who've signed up today, and thank you all so much for being part of our discussion. Please share with us where you are coming from so we just get a sense of where you are. So just to start first with talking a little bit about who you are, Ron, and what you bring to the conversation. You are the senior scientist and director of the Institute for Health and Productivity Studies at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And you have been leading innovative measurement and evaluation projects for organizations engaged in cutting edge research around the relationship between health and well-being, medical costs, and productivity. And you really have been the go-to person around evaluating the impact of workplace well-being for a long time. So I'm so excited to have you. And one of the things that we're going to have a chance to ask our audience members here is actually playing a game where you give me any metric that matters to you, to your organization, to your team. And our fabulous guest here, Ron, is going to show you how it connects to well-being. So people are coming in here. We've got people coming in from Walnut Creek in California, Calgary, San Diego, Raleigh, North Carolina, Cleveland, Ohio, Dublin, Ireland. So love that we have an international audience here. So let's dive right in, Ron. You want to start first with just sharing a little bit about your story and kind of what led you here to the work that you're doing today?
Yeah, so if I go back to my elementary school yearbook, they always ask me, what do you want to be? And I wrote down two things. I wanted to be a scientist and I wanted to be a comedian. They're kind of very different professions, but I'm now a scientist. That's actually my title at Johns Hopkins. I'm called a senior scientist. In terms of being a comedian, I like to communicate information in an entertaining way, in a way that's engaging and interesting, storytelling, but also combines data with the story so that you actually have something that's compelling to you and to the people you work with. So I started off as a nerd and still am a nerd, very interested in research, and learned a lot of my research skills back in grad school in the 1970s. At the same time, I was very interested in community health and well-being and worked on in a number of nonprofits or political organizations as a change agent, mostly in New York City, working police departments and daycare centers and landlords, and then landed a job at a medical school doing evaluation research there. And it was a very small team, myself basically doing a lot of that work. I then made a lot of changes in life, got married, moved to Connecticut, bought a home all within like a 2-week period, and worked for a social service agency in Connecticut, which was a really terrible, boring job. It was just awful. There were like 13 psychologists in the team, and everybody came in at 8. Everybody took lunch at noon, came back to work at 1, left at 4, and got nothing accomplished along the way. And that was not a good place to be. My very good friend who was working there, actually an anthropologist, said, there's a little startup company in New Haven and they need data people, researchers and so forth. Are you interested? I said, sure. Yeah, get me out of here. So I went to work for a startup called Corporate Health Strategies, only 10 employees. And I was, got to work immediately, write this report, it's due Monday, da-da-da-da-da. And about a month later, I was a director of marketing. Like, what? I knew nothing about marketing, nothing about business, nothing, but I was, running all over the country trying to sell people on this idea of data for insurance claims and healthcare and all that. And at that time, it was actually a very cool idea and very creative, innovative work that went into it. Even though I was terrible, I was like awful as a marketing salesperson, the company did very well. When I left it, it had, like grown 1,000, 2,000%. Eventually ended up being sold to another company and became a big deal. It's now a big, big deal. But then I worked at Johnson & Johnson for about 7 years, recruited there. And that's where I first became very familiar with the idea of health and well-being and kind of why that's important. Even though in my previous job, I was doing analytics and saying, you got to do this, you got to do that. It became quite clear that you got to go upstream. You got to deal with people's behaviors and environment and all the things that influence healthcare and healthcare costs. And at J&J, they were selling their internal Lift Life program to the outside world. And I became in charge of data and measurement and evaluation of those programs. And we published a ton of studies. And the concept, really grew tremendously in the landscape from just a few niche organizations and businesses doing it to right now, 90+% of American businesses will say they have wellness programs, although in reality, only about 10 to 20% have real effective impact programs. Went from there to work for another startup, MedStat, which was purchased by Thomson Reuters, which became Truven Health Analytics, and ended up being IBM Watson Health. So I spent about 26 years in the business world in various roles. And at the same time, about 20 years ago, I said, well, I'm really still a nerd. I'm really still an academic, and I want to be associated with the university. So we set up the Institute for Health and Productivity Studies at Cornell University, moved it to Emory University. Now I'm at Johns Hopkins doing really exciting work.
And great to hear such a breadth of experiences, being both directly working in the corporate environment, but that now in the academic environment, kind of tying the bridge between the two. You and I both talk about how research is important, but the translation of it perhaps is even more important. So I think that this is a really good segue to just looking at this question around workplace wellness not working. We've seen this so much in popular media. And in fact, there was a New York Times article that came out in 2014 that was titled, "Do Workplace Wellness Programs Work? ? Usually not, period." And that one article, I have to say, is really what inspired me to write my book, Workplace Wellness That Works, kind of the title. But I know that this is something that you've been speaking about for a long time, is to really understand that just because it's not working in a lot of cases doesn't mean that the possibility is still there, that it can work. But what are those, and as you talked about, in 20% of the cases, we do see it actually working. What is it that makes the difference between an initiative actually working versus one not working? And very quickly, just want to make sure for our listeners, please start to pose your questions to Ron, and we will take those along the way. So Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, interesting that you cite that article in the New York Times, written by really terrific economists. And their conclusion, of course, usually not. Coincidentally, that same month, September 2016, I think it was, we published a paper in the Journal of Occupational Environmental Medicine. There were 23 co-authors on the paper. And it was the same title, "Do Workplace Wellness or Health Promotion Programs Work?" We didn't have the answer in the title, but in the article, we said it depends. It really does depend on many key variables that are best practice in workplace programs. And most of the programs that are cited out there are very superficial. They're check marks. We've got a website, or our insurer has a website, or we give out a health assessment, or we do biometrics once a year, we have a health fair, but they really are not potent enough. They don't have the necessary dose to make a difference, and they don't engage a lot of people. Most of these programs, you'll find 10, 20% of the employees engage in some form of fashion, but those are, kind of the wellness warriors to begin with, or the worried well to begin with. These are people who really are concerned about the health and well-being, but they're not really the population that you want to get engaged and involved in the program. The successful programs, and we actually honor and recognize the best programs out there through our annual C. Everett Koop Award, and there are about 75 really clear-cut examples of programs that actually really work quite well. Those are the ones that use best practices. Mm-hmm. And we go back few decades actually in benchmarking what constitutes best practices. We've done studies with American Productivity Quality Center and their benchmarking studies, but most recently with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we went out and talked to employees and talked to the managers and talked to the program implementers and talked to the CEOs and said, what is it about your place that actually makes a difference? And we came up with kind of our secret sauce, top 10 ingredients of what constitutes best practices. We publish about that. I'm not going to go through all 10, but number 1 and 2, and they're kind of interchangeable, is a culture of health. You walk into the room, you walk into the building, you feel it. They really live, breathe health in all that they do and all their communications and the people you encounter. And people are actually quite happy and smiling like we are right now. Mm-hmm. But that only happens if you've got leadership support. And when I say leader, certainly the CEO, CFO, COO, those people are important, but it's your supervisor that often counts as much, if not more so, than what senior management is saying. If your supervisor says, I want you to have a happy life and a good job and something you get up in the morning and you look forward to, how do we do that? That makes a whole lot more difference than a memo that comes from senior executives. So those are kind of 1 and 2 interchangeable. Number 10 on the list is measurement and evaluation, which is what we do for a living, which is you may have the most beautiful program, great graphics, marketing, but if you don't measure whether it works or not, you don't know. You don't know if it's effective or not. So really, that's a lot of what we're doing, and I'm glad we're going to have this little game about how do you measure things.
That's great, and it's the famous Thomas Edison quote around a reporter asking him, how do you feel about the fact that you failed 1,000 times before you actually invented the light bulb? And he said, no. The light bulb was an invention that took 1,000 steps. And so this is our theme today around launching and iterating, that you got to try things out. But very importantly, as you spoke about, is you got to measure along the way. And to your point about what is the distinguishing factor between, the most important factor is this idea around culture of health. I often talk about how arguably we as human beings are more creatures of culture than we are creatures of habit. We tend to adapt to whatever culture that surrounds us. We may not actually see it, but it's the water we're swimming in, and it shapes our behaviors in ways that we might not ever imagine. I want to take some questions. Sid put in a question earlier. It was the one about the marketing question. What are marketing and or best practices you found to get people interested to take part of their workplace wellness program?
So this is internal marketing, I'm assuming. I think, the main message needs to come from the leadership of the organization. And they need to communicate to their frontline managers, but also the employees directly. And the other thing that's really important is a feedback loop. So you can't just top down say, we're going to have a climbing wall here next week, and the week after that, we're going to have meditation for everybody, and the third week, we're going to run a marathon and so forth. It's got to be, what do the employees want to do? Employees want to do what is interesting to them. It may be a book club. It may be, how do you cook well, or maybe, how do you take care of ailing parents? So you've got to have this feedback loop where employees themselves, and that can be through some kind of committee or it can be directly, tell you this is what would make a difference in my life in terms of my health and well-being. Can you help me with this? And for the senior management and supervisors responding to that. So it's not so much communication in terms of marketing and selling, which of course we do, but listening to the end user and finding out what your customer base, which is your employees, what do they want, and what's standing in the way, and how can you take some of those barriers away.
And so that really starts to shift from well-being at work feeling like something that is being done to me as an employee, as opposed to well-being that is being done for me and with me, that this is shared responsibility. We work together on it. And we've got somebody here who says, our company, like many others, have been expanding our programs to support the emotional, mental well-being of our employees. From your perspective, what are the best practices to truly make an impact on supporting emotional, mental well-being of our employees?
Well, we actually last year started a Center of Excellence funded by NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Center of Excellence focused on total worker health, but with a specific emphasis on mental health in the workplace. Now, the way that we structured the center was a little bit different than normal. We have what it's called as the Poe Center, kind of named after Edgar Allan Poe, who comes from Baltimore, where Hopkins is situated. But it also stands for P, which is psychosocial elements, O, organizational elements, and E, environmental elements. And what does that mean? It means when employers want to improve the health, mental health and well-being of their workers, they can't just say, here's a meditation app, or here's a program to increase your resilience, or here's, how to deal with stress and so forth. Eat healthy, exercise, sleep, and so forth. There's also an organizational component, which is, what if, my wage is too low? What if my boss is really harassing me and bullying me? What if there are policies in place that actually don't allow me to advance? I don't have a career path. I don't know what I'm doing here. So that's the O, the organizational factors. And oftentimes that's too much work, too little time, too little resources. But the environmental factors are also important. What if you're in a crowded, noisy office where you can't concentrate? What if you're exposed to a lot of heat or a lot of cold? What if there are no protective measures against COVID? All of those things are going to make you anxious, depressed, and not engaged in work as you ought to be. So to summarize, it's really the personal psychosocial factors, organizational factors, and environmental factors that you have to pay attention to in order to improve the health and well-being of your workforce. You can't just say, we have an EAP.
And unfortunately, as we see over and over again, this really requires a rewriting of our narrative around not only well-being, but particularly mental health, this kind of taboo topic of mental health. And so often it's been perceived as, oh, well, we have these EAP programs, which we know that most large organizations have EAP programs, but on average, I think it's less than 7% of eligible employees actually take advantage of them. Huge amount of stigma around actually taking advantage of those. But also, to your point, there are these larger structural issues. So no amount of EAP, no amount of yoga or mindfulness, as great as they are, can stand up to the weight of having a toxic boss, as you spoke about, or having to do the work of three, or working in a really stressful environment, just like you spoke about.
Yeah.
So we got a question here from Cam, which is, for selling wellness is perhaps the easiest way to sell to a CEO. Ron's graph of stress and LTAs helped sell wellness at Stelco. Thank you so much for sharing that, Cam. And over to you, Ron.
Well, there are different ways of, quote unquote, selling wellness. Oftentimes it's the senior executive of the organization says, this is important to me personally. I've just had a family member suffer a heart attack, or I lost an executive because of poor health, or I'm walking around and people look grumpy, and this is not a good thing for our company. So oftentimes, kind of the inspiration, motivation, and funding for a good program comes from senior executives, but it obviously needs to be transmitted down to the line staff, the people who actually have to do the work. The way to sell it is, I think, through storytelling. And people really respond to individual stories and relate to those. But you've got to back it up with data. And you can have the best story of this person who avoided the heart attack and and found cancer and the screening and all that. But unless you have data that says, well, here's the problem, here's the diagnosis, and here's what we've done. And by the way, it actually worked. It actually did move the needle in the right direction. Let's keep it up. Let's actually emphasize things that are working well and de-emphasize things or get rid of stuff that actually is not making much of a difference.
And that's the importance of launching and iterating. We try things out, we measure along the way to see what's working and what doesn't, and we're nimble enough to make those changes along the way. So I think that this also really touches nicely to the game we are now going to play, which is well-being done well at work is not only good for people, it is good for the bottom line. It is good for the organization. It's good for the team. So you give me any metric that matters to your organization. And Ron is going to show you how it ties to well-being. So let's get those questions rolling in. What's a metric that matters to you? And Ron is ready to make the case around how well-being connects to it. While we're waiting for that to come in, I'm going to pose one, which is innovation. How does that connect to well-being at work?
I think it connects to the idea of autonomy, to the extent that you are able to do things without very strict guidance from your manager, supervisor. There's the famous story that Google Maps, which I rely on almost every day, was developed by engineers who basically were given a day off by Google to do that. They're one day a week, they were able to do things that were creative that they wanted to do on their own without senior management telling them to do it. So basically, people given the latitude to be creative and getting a sense of, I can try this out, see if it works. And if it doesn't, if it fails, well, I learned in the failure, as Thomas Edison did, until I can somehow negotiate and navigate my way forward. If you think about science is all failures. Everything that we've ever discovered at some other point in time, not necessarily decided it was not right, but it needed to be adjusted. So the world was flat at one point, and we were the center of the universe at one point. All of those things are no longer true. We hope most people believe those things are no longer true. But even with COVID, you saw some early directions from scientists and the CDC, and they had to change those things. As new science comes in, you have to adapt and adjust. So creativity basically says, don't necessarily accept the status quo as a given, but question it, probe it, and make sure it's right. And you can do that empirically as well as intuitively.
And by the way, having that autonomy is not only good for innovation, but also one of the best things that we can do to help to reduce stress. When people feel a lack of autonomy, one of the biggest drivers of stress. Okay, we've got somebody, employee quit rates. Show me how that connects to well-being at work.
I think that's really simple. I hate my job. I'm out of here, But, if you've, and when you ask people what's important to you in getting a job, number one, of course, is salary and benefits. Yeah, absolutely. Number two, though, is being in an organization that understands me and really makes efforts to improve my health and well-being. So I may be in a job that doesn't pay twice what I could be getting on Wall Street, let's say, or something, but I really like the environment. I've got flexibility in hours. I like the people I work with. I like my boss. I can be creative in my job. And yeah, I'm not making tons and tons of money, but there are a lot of people who make tons and tons of money who are very unhappy. And in fact, have decided they want to become artists and tour the world and do other things besides just making a lot of money.
Okay. Elizabeth is saying this is an awesome activity. Love it. Thank you, Elizabeth. So keep those coming in. I'm going to pose another one until we get another one coming in, Ron, which is, okay, what's the connection between teacher well-being and academic performance on the part of the students?
That's an interesting one. And by the way, we're in the process of planning a mental health and workplace summit, a mental health and well-being summit at Johns Hopkins in 2023. We haven't landed on a date, but the focus will be on institutions of higher education and learning. So be on the lookout for that summit, which will be coming up next year, supported by the president and the dean of the School of Public Health. I think it's easy to detect from a student standpoint whether your instructor, lecturer, professor is on or not. If they're just reading rote materials or just telling you what's on their PowerPoint deck, it's obvious you're going to fall asleep. If they are engaging you, if they're interesting, they're funny. In fact, my first intro to psychology course, which had like 500 people in the auditorium, I remember the professor just running around the stage and doing funny things and really interesting things and engaging. I couldn't look away for a minute. That's when I decided I want to be a psychology major back in college. So I think it makes a huge difference if you like what you're doing, if you're interesting, if you're engaging, entertaining. and the students will be likewise, especially if you involve them in those conversations and they're not just passive observers.
So we've got a question here from Shaban. What are your thoughts on getting people with similar needs into peer groups?
I like that a lot. They're called ERGs, I think, employee resource groups. So you may like cooking. You may have children you have to take care of. You may have elders you have to take care of. You may like reading mystery novels. You may be in the LGBTQ plus community. You want to talk to other people like that. Absolutely. People do coalesce around common interests and common causes. And if you can bring them together and then insert messages or information that's valuable to the whole, to everybody in the organization, that will be ideal because, people like to be with other people, that we are social animals.
And, I've heard that when it comes to financial well-being, that having peer-to-peer conversations, or what an earlier guest of mine, Peter Frampton, characterized as money circles, where peers engage in conversation around, getting out of debt, or as opposed to just hearing from the expert. But these peer-to-peer conversations can, in fact, be incredibly powerful to help address issues like that as well. All right. What are your recommendations for key metrics to measure for ROI, VOI of worksite wellness?
All right. So the debate of ROI, VOI has been around for decades, and we've published a number of papers on ROI with large organizations. We're trying to move people away from ROI into the VOI space. And for those who don't know what those acronyms mean, ROI is return on investment. VOI is value on investment. And from an economist standpoint, ROI is a cost-benefit analysis. VOI is a cost-effectiveness analysis. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty details of what they are, but value is what really you ought to be searching for in your audience. What do they value? And if it's purely to make money, you may not be the right person that they need to talk to. There are other people who can do that. One of the easiest way to save money in healthcare is just cut benefits. Overnight, you'll save money. But I think the audience we want to talk to is, what's the value of doing this? What is it intrinsically important to you as a person, but also to the organization to make it a healthy organization?
So I love that distinction that you made of cost benefit versus cost effectiveness. And here we have our mutual friend Crockett Dale. What's the best way to define engagement with population health initiatives? And Crockett, that is actually, before we get your answer here, a perfect segue into promoting the course. Crockett and I are co-leads of a new course called Got Engagement, which is actually on sale, 30% off until December 31st. But Ron, I want to hear from you now around, and AJ is going to pop that into the chat here, how you can access that. But Ron, talk a little bit about engagement, if you would.
It's a very hard item to objectively operationally define. I've seen situations where people have signed up for 30, 40 classes, and it really makes no difference because they already knew the stuff and they just want to get away from work and go to classes and have fun. And in other cases, people have taken a biometric screening, discovered they have hypertension and high blood pressure and cholesterol and so forth, and they go to the doctor and they get treated for that. So you can't really put a time parameter around it. But I think engagement is like, this is something you look forward to do. So whether it's an employee resource group or a class that you do, yoga or fitness of some sort, or a class on cooking or something, you really like doing it, you're looking forward to doing it, that's engagement. And I don't think you have to be engaged in everything. In fact, in some cases, you may want to do these things on your own and not within a work setting, but you're still engaged in your own personal health and well-being.
So there's intrinsic engagement where it's not just a means to an end, such as losing. I do this so I can lose weight. Hard to sustain that and be engaged with that over time. But I do this because I feel energized. I get to connect with other people. Those intrinsic kinds of things. All right, Ron, we do have more questions that have come in. I'm sure we could keep this going all day. Thank you all so much for your comments and your questions. Top 3 takeaways, Ron, when we talk about this idea of launching and iterating, measuring along the way. What are your top 3 takeaways for our audience here in 30 seconds or less?
So what I'll do is say these are the factors that lead to unsuccessful programs, and they're poorly designed. They're not based on scientific evidence, or things like the CDC scorecard or the HERO scorecard or the American Heart Association scorecard. These are success factors. So you've got to have the proper design, proper elements, proper resources. Number two, you got to implement it correctly. You got to have the right people doing it. They've got to be idealists, they've got to be champions, and you've got to have senior management support. And three, evaluate, measure. So design, implement, and measure.
Awesome. So Ron, how can people, got engagement course is very valuable. Thank you so much, Jim, for that. So how can people stay in touch with you, Ron?
You'll send out my contact information. My email address is rgoetze1, not L, at jh.edu. JH stands for Johns Hopkins.
And AJ has popped that into the chat as well here. So our next guest, who is going to be the fourth Wednesday of the month again in January, is Dexter Sherney, president of the Blue Zones Wellbeing Institute, Adventist Health's Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer. Our topic next month is on the idea of going global. What are global best practices that we can all learn from so that we can actually get our workplace well-being initiatives to actually work? Ron, I want to thank you so much for being our awesome and amazing guest today. And I know that everybody here was very excited to have you. I know that based on all the comments and great questions that came in, but hopefully people will continue to converse with you all. We will have this recorded. This will be available for anybody who missed it to be able to tune into it later. But Ron, thank you so much for being my guest. Everyone, happy holidays. Thanks for joining us today on this topic, launch and iterate. See you in January.
Laura, thank you very much. Take care. Everybody have a good holiday. Bye-bye.